With an earth-shattering roar, the 10 berserkers plummeted from the blood-red sky, the weight of all mankind on their shoulders as they touched down on Varion 7 with the odds stacked 500 to 1 against them. But odds meant nothing to berserkers. Old Sergeant Janus leaned forward in his wheelchair, the dim light of the barracks glinting off his cybernetic eye, as he recounted the legendary tale to the fresh-faced recruits hanging on his every word. Janus told of the fateful day the Ventaxians invaded Varion 7, a human colony world rich in rare minerals. The reptilian bastards came with plasma rifles, hover tanks, and a hunger for conquest. The meager 500 human defenders were lambs to the slaughter against a horde of 5,000. Ventaxians killed Janus's buddies one by one. Varion 7 would fall. Humanity would be driven from the system. All hope was lost. 10 super soldiers, encased head to toe in advanced power armor, led by Captain Marcus Scorer, the man who spit in the face of impossible odds. If the berserkers failed here, Varion 7 would fall. Humanity's hold on the system would crumble. The Ventaxians would exterminate every last man, woman, and child. The very future of mankind hinged on these 10 warriors. There was no margin for error, no room for retreat, no option but victory. The berserkers strode forth to meet 5,000 Ventaxians in battle, their armor glinting beneath the dying sun. Mankind's last hope, knowing if they failed here, humanity dies. Janus's cybernetic eye gleamed as he continued his tale. Scorer and his berserkers charged into the Ventaxian lines like men possessed, their power armor making them move with superhuman speed and strength. I watched in awe as railgun rounds punched holes clean through the aliens' armor, and plasma swords sliced Ventaxian soldiers apart. The grizzled veteran's voice rose with excitement as he relived the memory. Captain Scorer was a force of nature, boys. His plasma sword cut through the lizards like a scythe through wheat, while he gunned down targets hundreds of meters out with that railgun of his. Damn, it was a thing of beauty to see him fight. Janus leaned forward, his mechanical hand clenching. The Ventaxians started to break. They'd never seen anything like the berserkers. Suddenly, they weren't so sure of themselves anymore. Their lines turned into a confused mess as they tried to figure out how to deal with Scorer's boys. A fierce grin spread across the old soldier's face. That was our chance. The Cap's courage was downright infectious. Me and the other defenders, we grabbed weapons off dead lizards and opened up on the Ventaxians. We'd been on the back foot the whole time, but now we had those scaly bastards running scared. Janus paused, his expression growing serious. But Scorer, he wasn't done, not by a long shot. He fought his way to the Ventaxian commander himself, a big ugly brute named Zorgax. The two of them went at it in a duel like nothing I've ever seen. Zorgax had size and advanced tech on his side, but Scorer, he had pure skill and an iron will that couldn't be beat. The old sergeant slammed his fist against his armrest. Scorer cut that alien down in front of his whole army. The berserker's plasma sword punched right through Zorgax's armor and took the lizard's head clean off. When those Ventaxians saw their leader fall, you could practically smell the fear coming off them. Janus leaned back in his wheelchair, letting the young soldiers absorb the gravity of Scorer's victory over Zorgax. The raw recruits sat in stunned silence, their eyes wide with awe and admiration. But the old sergeant wasn't finished with his tale just yet. Now you might think that with their commander dead, the Ventaxians would have turned tail and run, Janus said, his cybernetic eye glinting in the dim light. But these lizards, they had one last trick up their scaly sleeves. Just when we thought we had 'em beat, they unleashed their secret weapon, the Decimator. The veteran's voice grew grim as he described the massive, heavily armored walker. It stood over 100 feet tall, bristling with advanced weaponry that made the Ventaxians' previous arsenal look like child's play. The Decimator's plasma cannons and missile barrages tore through the human forces, obliterating entire squads with each volley. Even the berserkers, with all their fancy armor and weapons, couldn't seem to put a dent in that thing, Janus said, shaking his head. It was like hitting a brick wall with a toothpick. We were losing ground fast, and it looked like the Decimator was going to turn the tide of the whole damn battle. The old soldier leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. But Scorer, He wasn't about to let that walking scrap heap win the day. No, sir, not on his watch. He came up with a plan so crazy it just might work. Janus described how Skora ordered his berserkers to distract the decimator, drawing its fire away from the main human forces. Meanwhile, the captain himself, along with Lieutenant Jax and Sergeant Raven, his two most skilled warriors, snuck up on the walker's blind spot. They found this tiny maintenance hatch, barely big enough for a man to squeeze through, Janus said, his cybernetic hand mimicking the motion of opening a hatch. Skora and his team, they slipped inside that metal beast, ready to take it down from the inside out. The recruits leaned forward, hanging on every word as Janus recounted the intense close-quarters combat that followed. Skora, Jax, and Raven fought their way through the decimator's interior, their plasma swords and short-range plasma rifles making short work of the Ventaxian crew members and security drones that stood in their way. It was like watching a ballet of death, Janus said, his voice filled with a mix of awe and reverence. Skora and his team, they moved like they were one mind, one body. Their plasma swords cut through the lizard's armor like it was made of paper, and their rifles dropped any scaly bastard stupid enough to get in their way. The old sergeant's cybernetic eyes seemed to glow brighter as he relived the memory. I tell you, boys, I've never seen anything like it. Those three berserkers, they were unstoppable. They carved a path of destruction straight through the heart of that walking fortress, and the Ventaxians didn't know what hit 'em. The grizzled veteran's voice grew tense as he described the desperate struggle outside the decimator. While Skora and his team were fighting their way through that metal monstrosity, the rest of us were doing everything we could just to stay alive. The Ventaxians they weren't about to let up, even with their secret weapon under attack. Janus's cybernetic hand clenched into a fist as he relived the harrowing battle. The berserkers, they were dropping like flies, but they never stopped fighting. They kept drawing the decimator's fire, dodging plasma blasts and missiles with reflexes that seemed almost inhuman. It was like they knew every move that walking scrap heap was going to make before it even made it. Inside the decimator, Skora, Jax, and Raven had finally battled their way to the control room. Janus leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. That's when they came face to face with Krazax, the Ventaxian pilot. This guy, he was a monster, all augmented with cybernetics and gene mods. He made the other lizards look like hatchlings in comparison. The old sergeant described the brutal hand-to-hand combat that ensued, with Skora and Krazax trading blows that would have shattered a normal man's bones. Their armor was dented, their weapons were sparking, but neither one of them was willing to back down. It was like watching two titans clash, neither one giving an inch. As Skora and Krazax fought, Jax and Raven worked feverishly to sabotage the decimator's weapon systems. Janus's voice grew urgent as he described the scene. They were slapping explosives on every weak point they could find, trying to bring that walking fortress down from the inside. But they knew they didn't have much time. Krazax, he was pushing Skora to his limits, and it looked like the cap might not be able to hold out much longer. But just when it seemed like Krazax might gain the upper hand, Skora unleashed a flurry of plasma sword strikes that severed the Ventaxian's augmented limbs. Janus slammed his fist against his armrest, his voice rising with excitement. Krazax! He let out this unholy scream as his arms and legs went flying. But Skora, he didn't hesitate. He drove his plasma sword right through that scaly bastard's heart, ending the fight once and for all. With Krazax defeated, Skora, Jax, and Raven made their escape, detonating the explosives as they leaped clear of the decimator. Janus's voice was filled with awe as he described the moment. The whole battlefield shook as that metal beast went up in flames. Its armor, once impenetrable, was now nothing more than twisted, molten slag. The Ventaxians, they couldn't believe their eyes. Their secret weapon, their ace in the hole, had been destroyed by just 3 human warriors. The recruits sat in stunned silence as Janus paused, letting the gravity of the moment sink in. The decimator, the Ventaxians' last hope of victory, had been reduced to a smoldering wreck, and the tide of the battle had turned in humanity's favor. But the old sergeant's tale was far from over, and the young soldiers leaned forward eagerly, waiting to hear what happened next. Janus shook his head, his voice growing grim as he recounted the aftermath of the Decimator's fall. "You think those lizards would have turned tail and run after seeing their secret weapon go up in flames? But they were a stubborn bunch. Sure, some of them retreated, but the rest? They just kept coming like they had nothing left to lose." The old sergeant leaned forward, his cybernetic eye glinting in the dim light of the barracks. "But that wasn't the worst of it. Just when we thought we might catch a breather, a new group of Ventaxians entered the fray. They called themselves the Shadow Blades, and let me tell you, boys, they were a whole different breed of trouble." Janus described the Shadow Blades' sleek black armor and advanced stealth technology, which allowed them to move undetected through the chaos of the battlefield. "It was like fighting ghosts," he said, his voice tense with the memory. "One moment, you think you're in the clear, and the next you've got a plasma blade sticking out of your gut." The Shadow Blades, Janus explained, had one primary target, the human commanders, including Scorer and his remaining berserkers. They wanted to cut the head off the snake, so to speak, take out our leaders, and the rest of us would fall apart. Scorer, his armor battered and his weapons running low on power, found himself locked in a deadly game of cat and mouse with the Shadow Blades. Janus's voice grew tense as he described the scene. The Cap, he was running on fumes, but he wasn't about to let those sneaky bastards get the drop on him. He had to rely on his instincts, his training, to stay one step ahead. The grizzled veteran's cybernetic hand clenched into a fist as he relived the harrowing skirmishes that followed. "It was like watching a deadly dance," he said, his voice filled with a mix of awe and fear. Scorer, he'd be there 1 second and gone the next, always staying just out of reach of those Shadow Blades, but even he couldn't keep it up forever. As the Shadow Blades whittled down the berserkers' numbers, Scorer knew he had to do something drastic to even the odds. Janus leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. That's when the Cap had his stroke of genius. He lured those stealthy sons of bitches into a nearby industrial complex, a real maze of pipes and catwalks. Figured their fancy cloaking devices wouldn't do 'em much good in close quarters. The recruits hung on Janus's every word as he described the tense close-quarters combat that ensued within the industrial complex. Scorer, using his intimate knowledge of the layout, turned the tables on the Shadow Blades, engaging them in lightning-fast ambushes and hit-and-run attacks. "It was like the Cap had turned into a ghost himself," Janus said, a hint of pride creeping into his voice. "Those Shadow Blades, they never knew what hit 'em. 1 minute, they'd be creeping down a catwalk, and the next, Scorer would be on top of 'em, his plasma sword cutting through their fancy armor like it was made of tissue paper." But even with Scorer's clever tactics, the Shadow Blades proved to be a formidable foe. Janus's voice grew tense as he recounted the desperate struggle within the industrial complex, with Scorer and his few remaining berserkers fighting tooth and nail to survive against the relentless Ventaxian assassins. The recruits sat transfixed as Janus recounted the desperate battle inside the industrial complex. Scorer and his boys, they knew this place like the back of their hands. They'd trained in facilities just like it, back on Earth. The Shadow Blades, for all their fancy tech, were fighting on our turf now. The old sergeant's voice grew tense as he described the brutal close-quarters combat that erupted within the maze of pipes, catwalks, and machinery. Plasma swords clashed against poisoned blades, the confined spaces forcing the combatants to rely on their raw skill and lightning-fast reflexes. Scorer, he was like a man possessed, Janus said, his cybernetic eye glinting in the dim light. His armor was scorched and dented, his body battered and bleeding, but he never slowed down. He cut through those Shadow Blades like a plasma torch through butter. The berserkers, Janus explained, used their intimate knowledge of the complex's layout to their advantage, luring the Shadow Blades into carefully prepared kill zones. They rigged makeshift traps using industrial equipment, turning the Ventaxian stealth technology against them. 1 minute, a Shadow Blade would be cloaked and creeping along a catwalk, Janus said, his voice filled with grim satisfaction. The next, they'd trip a sensor and a blast door would slam shut, cutting them off from their squad. That's when Scorer or one of his boys would pounce, their plasma swords making short work of the isolated alien. As the battle raged on, the Berserkers' numbers dwindled, but so did the Shadow Blades. Skora, despite his injuries and exhaustion, never faltered, his determination to protect his fellow humans driving him forward. Janus leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. Finally, it came down to Skora and Zekris, the Shadow Blade leader. These two, they were the best of the best, and they both knew it. They circled each other in this big, open chamber, their blades humming with barely contained energy. The old sergeant's cybernetic hand clenched into a fist as he described the final duel. Skora and Zekris traded blows with blinding speed, their plasma swords clashing in showers of sparks. The Shadow Blade leader was fast, his poisoned blade darting in and out like a viper's strike, but Skora was faster. It was like watching a master swordsman at work, Janus said, his voice filled with awe. Skora he parried and dodged, always staying one step ahead of Zekris. You could see the frustration building in the alien's eyes, the realization that he was outmatched. In a final desperate gambit, Zekris lunged forward, his poisoned blade aimed at Skora's heart. But the human captain was ready. With a lightning-fast riposte, Skora sidestepped the blow and drove his plasma sword through Zekris's chest, the superheated blade punching through the Shadow Blade leader's armor like it was made of paper. Zekris he let out this horrible gurgling sound as he collapsed, his poisoned blade clattering to the floor, Janus said, his voice grim. With their leader dead, the rest of the Shadow Blades just fell apart. Skora and his boys mopped them up in minutes. The recruits sat in stunned silence as Janus paused, letting the weight of Skora's victory sink in. The Shadow Blades, the Ventaxians' most elite warriors, had been defeated, their leader slain by the indomitable human captain. But even as the Berserkers emerged from the industrial complex, their armor battered and their numbers reduced to a mere handful, they knew the battle for Varion 7 was far from over. As the battered Berserkers emerged from the industrial complex, Janus recounted, their armor scorched and stained with alien blood, a cheer erupted from the remaining human defenders. The sight of Skora and his warriors, standing tall amidst the carnage, ignited a fire in their hearts. Those boys, they were a sight for sore eyes, let me tell you, Janus said, his voice filled with pride. Seeing them walk out of that death trap, their weapons still smoking, it was like a shot of adrenaline straight to the heart. Skora raised his plasma sword high, the blade glowing a fierce blue, and bellowed a war cry that echoed across the battlefield. The human forces, their spirits rejuvenated, surged forward like a tidal wave, crashing into the Ventaxian lines with renewed ferocity. As the battle raged, a new sound filled the air, a high-pitched scream that grew louder with each passing second. Janus pointed to the sky, his cybernetic eye whirring as it focused on the incoming shapes. That's when the cavalry arrived, he said, a grin spreading across his weathered face, a squadron of Zephyr-class fighters, fresh from the fleet. They came in low and fast, their pulse cannons lighting up the sky like a damn fireworks show. The sleek silver ships danced through the air, their pilots weaving between plasma blasts and missiles with unnatural grace. They rained fire upon the Ventaxian ranks, their weapons tearing through armor and flesh alike, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. Skora, seizing the moment, rallied his berserkers for one final push. "For Earth!" he roared, his voice booming through their comms. "For humanity!" The berserkers charged, their weapons spitting plasma, and their armor glinting in the sun. They crashed into the Ventaxian formation like a hammer blow, their fury and determination overwhelming the alien defenses. Janus's eyes gleamed as he described the chaos that engulfed the battlefield. Skora's plasma sword cut through the Ventaxian soldiers like a scythe through wheat, while his berserkers fought with a savage intensity that bordered on madness. Ventaxian warriors fell by the dozens, their armor no match for the humans' relentless onslaught. "It was like watching a force of nature," Janus said, his voice filled with awe. "Those berserkers, they were unstoppable. The Ventaxians, they didn't know what hit them." As the battle reached its climax, Skora found himself face to face with Zarax, the last Ventaxian commander. The alien warrior was a towering figure, his armor adorned with the trophies of fallen foes, his eyes burning with hatred. The two warriors collided in a clash of plasma and steel, their weapons locked in a deadly embrace. They fought with a skill and ferocity that left even the battle-hardened Janus breathless. Plasma swords flashed and sparked as Skora and Zarax dueled across the blood-soaked ground, neither giving an inch. The Ventaxian commander was a formidable opponent, his every blow backed by centuries of combat experience, but Skora fought with the strength of a man who carried the hopes and dreams of an entire species on his shoulders. "It was a battle for the ages," Janus said, his voice barely above a whisper. Two titans locked in a struggle that would decide the fate of Varion 7 and maybe even the whole damn war. As Skora and Zarax clashed in a storm of sparks and plasma, the grizzled veteran continued his tale, his voice rising with the fury of the battle. Just when it looked like Skora might get the upper hand, that slimy Ventaxian bastard pulled a fast one. Zarax slammed his fist against his chest, activating some kind of energy shield that encased him in a shimmering bubble of force. The recruits gasped as Janus described the impenetrable barrier that now separated the two combatants. Skora's plasma sword, so effective against Ventaxian armor, merely glanced off the shield's surface, leaving Zarax unharmed. Skora knew he was in trouble, Janus said, his cybernetic eye whirring as he focused on the memory. His weapons were about as useful as a wooden stick against that damn shield, but he didn't panic. He just adapted. The captain dodged and weaved as Zarax pressed his advantage, his plasma blade and energy whip lashing out with deadly precision. Skora's armor, already battered from the day's fighting, sizzled and sparked as he narrowly avoided each blow. Skora realized he needed to change the game, Janus continued, his voice tight with tension. He couldn't breach that shield with his weapons, so he did the only thing he could. He got in close and personal. Using his suit's enhanced strength, Skora lunged forward, grappling with Zarax in a desperate bid to nullify the Ventaxian's technological advantage. The two warriors strained against each other, their muscles bulging beneath their armor as they sought to overpower their opponent. "It was like watching two titans wrestle," Janus said, his voice filled with awe. Skora and Zarax locked in a deadly embrace, each trying to gain the upper hand, but Skora, he had a plan. As the warriors struggled, Skora began to maneuver Zarax across the battlefield, his movements deliberate and calculated. Janus's eyes widened as he realized what the captain was doing. Skora was steering Zarax towards one of those wrecked Ventaxian hover tanks, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The damn thing's reactor core was exposed, leaking radiation like a burst pipe. It was a death trap. The recruits held their breath as Janus described the final desperate moments of the duel. Skora, his strength waning, summoned every ounce of power left in his battered body. With a roar of defiance, he shoved Zarax backward, sending the Ventaxian commander stumbling towards the ruptured reactor core. Zarax never saw it coming, Janus said, his voice grim. He hit that reactor like a ton of bricks, and the radiation, it just tore through his shield like it was made of paper. There was this blinding flash of light, and when it cleared, Zarax was just a smoking husk on the ground. Skora, his armor's advanced radiation shielding protecting him from the worst of the blast, stood tall amidst the carnage, his plasma sword still crackling with energy. He had done the impossible, defeating the Ventaxian commander against all odds. "That was the moment, boys," Janus said, his voice filled with pride. "That was when we knew we had a chance. Skora, he showed us that the Ventaxians weren't invincible, that even their best could be beaten. And let me tell you, that knowledge, it was like a fire in our bellies." As the news of Zarax's fall spread through the Ventaxian ranks like a poisonous wind, the alien soldiers' resolve crumbled faster than a sandcastle in a hurricane. Janus watched in awe as the once fearsome Ventaxian army disintegrated into a chaotic mass of fleeing soldiers, their weapons abandoned, their formation shattered. "It was something out of a damn nightmare for those scaly bastards," Janus said, his voice tinged with grim satisfaction. "One minute, they're this unstoppable force, the next they're running like frightened hatchlings. Skora and his boys, they did that. They broke the Ventaxians in a way no one thought possible. But Skora, ever the tactician, knew that the battle was far from over. He rallied his remaining berserkers, his voice booming through their comms. "This is our chance, brothers. We drive these bastards off Varion 7 for good, for Earth, for humanity." The berserkers roared their approval, their weapons held high, their spirits invigorated by their captain's words. They surged forward, a tide of steel and fury, ready to deliver the killing blow to the Ventaxian invasion. As if summoned by the hand of fate itself, a fresh wave of human reinforcements arrived on the battlefield. Janus's eyes widened as he saw the insignia on their exosuits, the snarling visage of a hellhound, jaws dripping with blood. "The hellhounds," Janus whispered, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and fear. "I never thought I'd see them in action. They were the stuff of legend, even among us grunts." The hellhounds crashed into the Ventaxian ranks, their exosuits towering over the alien soldiers. The sound of their rail cannons and missile launchers was like the roar of an angry god, each shot tearing great holes in the Ventaxian lines. Skora, seeing the opportunity, rallied his berserkers to fight alongside their new allies. The captain was a whirlwind of destruction, his plasma sword and railgun cutting down Ventaxians left and right. The aliens, already demoralized by Zarax's death and the arrival of the hellhounds, could do little to stop the human onslaught. "It was a thing of beauty in a way," Janus said, his voice filled with a strange mix of reverence and horror. Skora and the hellhounds, they moved like they'd been fighting together for years. Every shot, every swing of the captain's sword, it was all perfectly coordinated. The Ventaxians never stood a chance. As the battle reached its climax, the Ventaxians made a desperate attempt to retreat to their landing craft, hoping to escape the fury of the human forces. But Skora and the hellhounds pursued them relentlessly, their weapons never falling silent, their advance never slowing. "Those final moments, they were the most desperate of the whole damn battle," Janus said, his cybernetic eye whirring as he focused on the memory. The Ventaxians, they were fighting like cornered rats, knowing that they had nowhere to run. But Skora and the hellhounds, they just kept pushing, kept cutting the aliens down until there was nothing left but a field of corpses and broken armor. But even in defeat, the Ventaxians had one last card to play. A group of fanatics, their minds twisted by the shame of their loss, launched a suicidal attack on the human lines. They charged forward, their bodies laden with powerful explosives, ready to take as many humans with them as they could. Janus's voice grew tense as he described the scene. It was like something out of a damn horror movie. These Ventaxians, they were running straight at us, screaming in their alien tongue, their eyes wide with madness. We could see the bombs strapped to their chests, knew what they were planning. But Skora, he didn't hesitate, not for a second. The old sergeant leaned forward, his cybernetic hand clenching into a fist. Skora ordered the hellhounds to focus their fire on the suicidal Ventaxians. Rail cannons and plasma rifles tore into the charging aliens, detonating their explosives prematurely. The whole battlefield shook with the force of the blasts, the ground itself cracking and splitting beneath our feet. Janus shook his head, his expression a mix of awe and disbelief. I still don't know how Skora knew what to do. It was like he had a sixth sense for battle, an instinct that went beyond anything I'd ever seen. If it hadn't been for him and the hellhounds, those fanatics would have taken out half our damn force. As the smoke cleared and the echoes of the explosions faded, an eerie silence fell over the battlefield. The Ventaxians were broken, their army shattered, their will to fight extinguished. Skora's eyes widened as he saw the suicidal Ventaxian fanatics charging towards the human lines, their bodies laden with powerful explosives. The captain knew that if those aliens reached his men, the detonation would be catastrophic. Without hesitation, he barked an order to the hellhounds, his voice cutting through the chaos of the battlefield like a knife. As the mechanized infantry obeyed, their massive exosuits stomping back towards the rest of the human soldiers, Skora turned to his remaining berserkers. The captain's eyes blazed with a fierce determination as he addressed his warriors. Brothers, this is our final stand. We stop those fanatics here, or Varion 7 falls. The Berserkers nodded grimly, their weapons at the ready as they formed a line between the oncoming Ventaxians and the retreating human forces. Skora stood at the center of the line, his plasma sword crackling with energy, his railgun held firmly in his other hand. Janus watched in awe as Skora and his Berserkers met the charging Ventaxians head-on, their weapons blazing with a furious intensity. The captain was a whirlwind of destruction, his plasma sword cleaving through the alien fanatics as if their armor were made of paper. The Berserkers fought with a savage determination, their railguns and plasma rifles cutting down the Ventaxians by the dozens. But still, the suicidal aliens kept coming, heedless of their own lives as they sought to detonate their explosives among the human defenders. Skora, realizing that even his Berserkers could not hold back the tide forever, made a fateful decision. With a roar of defiance, the captain charged into the midst of the Ventaxian fanatics, his plasma sword flashing with deadly precision. Skora cut down the aliens left and right, his movements a blur as he sought to detonate their explosives before they could reach the human lines. Janus's voice grew heavy with emotion as he recounted the final moments of Skora's charge. The old veteran's cybernetic eye flickered as he relived the memory of that fateful day. "It was like watching a man wrestle with death itself," Janus said, his words barely above a whisper. Skora, he knew what he had to do, knew that the only way to stop those fanatics was to blow their explosives early, even if it meant sacrificing himself. As Skora fought his way deeper into the mass of Ventaxian fanatics, the air around him grew thick, with the scent of ozone and burning flesh. The captain's armor, already battered and scorched from the long battle, began to splinter and crack under the relentless onslaught. And then, in a blinding flash of light and a deafening roar, the Ventaxian explosives detonated. Janus flinched as he remembered the sight of the maelstrom of fire and shrapnel that engulfed Skora and the remaining alien fanatics. The shockwave from the blast rippled across the battlefield, knocking soldiers from their feet and sending debris flying in all directions. As the smoke and dust began to clear, the human forces searched desperately for any sign of their beloved captain. But all they found were the charred remains of his armor, twisted and blackened by the incredible heat of the explosion. Skora's body had been consumed by the blast, his sacrifice ensuring that the Ventaxian fanatics could not reach the human lines. Janus paused, his gaze distant as he remembered the aftermath of that final desperate stand. The Ventaxians, their will to fight shattered by the loss of their fanatical brethren and the relentless human assault, began to flee the battlefield. Their landing craft, once a symbol of their impending victory, now served as their only means of escape as they abandoned Varion 7 to its human defenders. The old veteran's voice was heavy with a mix of pride and sorrow as he addressed the young soldiers seated before him. That day Varion 7 was saved, but at a terrible cost. Skora and his Berserkers, they gave everything they had to protect their fellow humans. Their sacrifice will never be forgotten, not as long as there are those who remember the story of their courage and their valor. Janus leaned forward, his gaze intense as he locked eyes with each of the recruits in turn. But remember this, boys. The battle for Varion 7 was just one fight in a much larger war. The Ventaxians, they're still out there, still a threat to every human world in the galaxy. And it's up to us to make sure that Skora's sacrifice was not in vain. The old sergeant's voice grew stronger, filled with a fierce determination. As long as humanity can produce heroes like Skora and his Berserkers, there will always be hope. No matter how dark the night, no matter how great the sacrifice required, we will keep fighting. We will keep pushing back against the alien menace until the day comes when we can finally say that the galaxy is free from their tyranny. Janus sat back in his wheelchair, his cybernetic eye glinting in the dim light of the barracks. The recruits sat in silence, their minds filled with the weight of the old veteran's words. They knew that the road ahead would be long and fraught with danger, that many more heroes like Skora would be called upon to lay down their lives in defense of humanity. But they also knew that they could not falter, could not let the sacrifices of their forebears be in vain. For as long as there were humans like Janus to remember the stories of the past, to pass on the lessons of courage and sacrifice to the next generation, there would always be hope for a brighter future. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.